Hello everyone, it's Nick. Welcome to Here's a Wild Thought. And today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, the failures on the left. But don't run away just yet, because it's not just the left who has failed here. It's a larger discussion about failures of liberalism in major cities, which has been a topic for at least the past several months since Donald Trump's re-election. On TikTok this weekend, Ezra Klein did a 15-minute rant about the Democratic Party and their inability to govern states like New York and California effectively, and how that affects their image nationally. And I think he's right about most of that. In the piece, he talks about California's high-speed rail disaster. He talks about building a Second Avenue subway in New York, and how a lot of these infrastructure projects go on for years and over budget and just make it look like Democrats don't know what they're doing. But one of the topics he did discuss and he did focus on was housing. One of the issues that Democrats have in the blue states is that the populations in the blue states are not growing as much as they are in the red states. Interestingly, populations are growing, but they're not growing at the same rate. More people are leaving than coming in some cases, and even if the balance does lead to a net migration in, as is the case in New York, it's not as big as in states like Texas and Florida and Arizona. So the end result of that is that the states don't look like they're being adequately run. But the main reason for this is housing, and specifically the cost of housing. And the problem with that is lack of housing. And states like Texas and Florida, which are building houses at very quick rates, are keeping the price of housing down because the demand is meeting the supply, and the supply is meeting the demand, which isn't the case in many big blue states. And so it's important to explore why, and I really wanted to touch on that in this video, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding as to why states like New York and California are not building enough housing, while states like Florida and Texas and North Carolina are. And it does have to do with regulations, and Ezra Klein touched on this, where he talks about a lot of government regulations in so much as the environment and in racial diversity and bias and issues like that arose out of the mid-20th century to create a more fairer world is getting in the way. Environmental reviews being one of the reasons why the California high-speed rail line has gone off the rails, so to speak, no pun intended. That is a major reason why. And before I touch on housing, I want to touch a little bit on infrastructure and how we built infrastructure in the 20th century. You know, there's a scene in The Newsroom, which I never particularly liked, with Jeff Daniels, that has gone viral since it first aired about 15 years ago, where he talks about how America is no longer the greatest country in the world. And in it, he says that we used to build big things and we don't do that anymore, but never really explores why. And I think the one thing that we sort of leave out when we talk about how we built big things is we did it without really sort of acknowledging how it might affect the people who were, so to speak, in the way. So I'll give you a good example here, and it's on Long Island. If you've ever been to Long Island, you know that there's 3 actually major limited access highways that run along the length of the island. There's 2 parkways, the Southern State and the Northern State parkways, which are open to non-commercial traffic. They predate the expressway system. They date back to the 1920s and 1930s. They were part of Robert Moses's grand plan for New York. They are run through some very interesting courses where they're very sort of curvy, and they meander through the island. They don't have a direct line. And the reason they were built that way is they were built in the 1920s and 1930s, as I said, and they were built around neighborhoods. They were built to sort of avoid communities and avoid having to bulldoze properties and stuff. The Long Island Expressway, which is the major truck route through Long Island, if you look at it on a map, it looks like it's a direct straight line. And the reason for that is that the Long Island Expressway is an interstate highway. It's Interstate 495. It was built with federal money as a federal project, and it was constructed years later than the parkways, finally finishing at exit 73 in the 1970s. When the federal government stepped in and got involved, they didn't have the same sort of regulations that Robert Moses did, because Dwight Eisenhower, when he was president, who authorized the interstate highway system, authorized it as a national security issue. He took the inspiration for the interstate highway system from the Autobahns in Germany, which Adolf Hitler built before World War II, which weren't meant necessarily for traveling, but was meant to sort of move military equipment from the Eastern Front to the Western Front fairly quickly. Eisenhower, who greatly feared a two-pronged invasion of the United States on both coasts, wanted the same. He wanted to be able to move military equipment from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the North to the South, fairly quickly, and saw the interstate highway system as a means of doing that, also as a means of moving goods and services across the country and allowing people to travel. Because he did this as a national security issue, he was able to sort of ignore a lot of regulations and ignore a lot of concerns over how it would affect communities and the environment and other factors, and he just basically bulldozed neighborhoods and bulldozed forests and just took over. This is how he built a lot of other infrastructure as well. We drowned entire towns to build reservoirs. We demolished entire neighborhoods to build airports and seaports. We built runways over cemeteries, and we did this without any thought in how it could affect minority communities. In the South, a lot of black communities were just destroyed in order to build infrastructure. Native American communities were destroyed. And so we did a lot of that in the 20th century, but that is also how we were able to build big, great things. And by the time we got to the 1970s and 1980s in the post-civil rights era, and we were primarily starting to be concerned with how those things affected Black Americans and Native Americans and other and poor communities, we no longer were building great big things because those great big things had required us to do it in ways that were unfair. That's one primary reason why we no longer build big things. And it's something that I think a lot of liberals do not want to face. They don't want to consider the possibility that in order to become an infrastructure magnet the way that China is or other countries are, we have to go back to not caring about how things affect the environment and how things affect poor communities. I mean, China is able to build massive rail lines and seaports and airports because they don't have any concern over how it would affect, the environment, wildlife, or even their own people. And I'm not saying, as Ezra said in his piece, I'm not saying we should become China, but just keep us on the understanding that that's the type of thing that might be required. And this goes to housing as well. In New York, one of the reasons why we haven't built housing is that one of the most powerful forces in New York City politics, even though they don't have any actual political force, they do have influence, and that's the community boards. Community boards are unelected, appointed volunteer organizations, usually up to 50 people on the boards, who represent the community and deal with issues like land use and liquor licenses. There are 59 of them across the whole city. Their territory generally coincides with one of the NYPD police precincts. The members are appointed by the city council members who cover those communities, and then unofficially by the borough presidents. Each borough has a certain number of community boards. The largest ones have more than 24. The smallest one, Staten Island, I think only has 3. And so these boards do not have any political power. They can't veto legislation. They can't pass legislation, but they have plenty of influence over city council members, plenty of influence over local officials, and they can make a big stink. And local journalists, like myself for 10 years, tend to cover these community boards and treat them as unofficial representations of the communities. And so because of that, they have a lot of political influence, if not power. And community boards in much of the city don't change much. And this has become a very big problem in the early 2010s when many of the community boards were being governed by 20, 30, 40 people who had been on these boards for decades and were not representative of the neighborhoods that have changed in the last few decades. And this led to a lot of calls for reform and even calls to completely get rid of the community boards entirely. Now, the community boards that I covered when I was a journalist for 10 years in Queens were, generally speaking, very conservative on land use issues. They were not friendly to the idea of development. And in many cases, the city council members who represented these districts would appoint members who were not also very favorable to development. And sometimes, if the city council members wouldn't, community board members and community board leaders who were not favorable to development or favorable to a lot of progressive ideas of change would themselves run for the city council and in some cases win. Robert Holden, who is a city council member from Queens and one of the more conservative members of the city council, who was extremely critical of the idea of development and adding more housing, was actually a member of Community Board 5 in Queens before he decided to run for the city council in 2017 and win the seat. These bodies have that kind of influence, and almost universally they oppose any kind of development, and they will fight it. And they don't have direct power to kill development, but they have very strong influence over the city council members to slow or completely kill the idea of development. So housing in New York City hasn't really changed much in the last 50 or 60 years, unless you were in parts of Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens along the riverfront, where there's been plenty of development, because these were industrial areas where it was very easy to rezone them for residential and build residential development. But in the neighborhoods themselves, very little has changed. I'll give you one prime example from where I grew up. When I was a kid, there was a house on my block where I grew up that looked like this. It was a 2-family detached home, suburban in style, with a big yard. In the mid-2000s, the house was torn down and replaced by this. The act of going from this to this pissed off a lot of people on my block and in my community. And it wasn't the only case of this happening. Now, in this specific instance, a 2-family house on a land that was allotted for 3 plots or 3 houses was torn down and replaced by what can legally be built there, which was 3 townhouses, 3 2-family townhouses. And that increased the number of housing units on this plot from 2 to 6, triple the number of people who could live on this plot. Now, if we're trying to add housing, this is a good thing, right? This is a very good thing for the community. It's a good thing for the city. It brings down the cost of housing because now there's more housing, supply is increasing and meeting the demand. But in my neighborhood, it pissed the people off. What was a beautiful suburban house with a nice yard and the lawn was now this ugly brick building with no green space, and it also added more parking and more traffic and so on and so forth. And progressives will hear this and say, but you live in New York City. And that's true. But the thing about New York City and a lot of these cities where housing is a problem, including Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, is that they were built in the 20th century to have a dense downtown area, but also plenty of suburban-like single-family to 2-family house communities, like the one that I grew up in Ozone Park, Queens. You see that if you drive around Los Angeles in places like Beverly Hills, the areas around Beverly Hills specifically. You see that in San Francisco when you go out by Golden Gate Park. You see that in Chicago with neighborhoods like Mount Greenwood. And so these neighborhoods exist, and most of the 20th century, they were being built up into these suburban, communities. In New York City specifically, we have communities called two-fare zones. And that name comes from the fact that in the post-war period, when these neighborhoods were built up, in the between the 1920s and 1950s, they were suburban style. The subways did not go there. And so you needed to pay 2 fares to get to Manhattan, which meant taking a bus to a subway. And this is before the Metro card, when you were able to do transfers, you had to pay with a token. And so you had to pay 2 fares. And a 2-fare zone, as it was called, was actually a plus thing. You would put it in a housing ad because people would want to live in 2-fare zones. For the same reason why people want to move to the suburbs, because it was considered to be safer, it was considered to be more posh, it was considered to be a better investment in the future to buy houses in these communities. And these cities sort of survived that way for a long time, because if you remember the period between the 1960s to the 1980s and 90s, most of these cities lost population. There was significant white flight, and so the balance remained where there was enough demand to meet the supply, and housing wasn't really an issue. It started to become an issue in the 1990s when many of America's great cities saw a massive drop in crime, the crack epidemic had ended, and now people wanted to live in the cities again. But we never grew beyond what we were when the cities peaked in the 1940s and 1950s. So when the populations of these cities grew again and met what they were in the 1950s, and then surpassed it as they did in the 90s and 2000s, suddenly we had a problem here. There wasn't enough housing. And now we had to rethink how we did housing in the cities. We were beyond what the demand wanted, and so we had to start increasing supply. Now, we'll get into why that was a problem in a minute, but you're going to ask me why this wasn't an issue in cities like Houston or Dallas or in parts of Florida or in Arizona. Well, the simple reality is that those cities had never grown, lost people, and then grown again, the way that cities like New York or Philadelphia or Chicago or Los Angeles or San Francisco did. Houston had always grown, Atlanta had always grown, Dallas had always grown, Miami had always grown, and so they were able sort of to grow out beyond where they were initially when white flight started to happen. And also, these cities are in states where there is copious amount of land. You could just keep growing out, right? If you go to a place like Houston, you will see that there are entire neighborhoods that didn't exist 20 years ago. You don't have that in New York. There's no more land to build in New York. There's no more land to build in Los Angeles. You have to go beyond the mountains into the Antelope Valley and start building up there. And indeed, if you do move up there to someplace like Palmdale or Lancaster, the housing costs are somewhat lower than they are in the Los Angeles basin itself. In San Francisco, you're on a peninsula. You're surrounded by water on three sides. And south of you is already a densely populated area, the Silicon Valley. There isn't a lot of spaces to sort of grow. And so the only place to grow is up. And that means that you'll have to do things like tear down a 2-family house and replace it with a 6-family complex like they did on my block where I grew up. And that's not very popular in places like New York. And the question you're going to ask is, how come no one wants to do that? And that's the question that Ezra Klein asked. Well, there's no constituency for it. That's the issue. Liberals don't want to do it. Conservatives don't want to do it. This is the type of thing that gets shot down on community boards in New York, whether they be liberal ones, like the ones that exist in parts of Brooklyn and Manhattan, or conservative ones, like the ones that I covered in Queens, and that exist in places like the East Bronx. So a good example of this is I'll take you to the East Bronx. The East Bronx is part of the city where I think a lot of people who aren't from New York don't really know what it's like. This is the heart of the congressional district represented by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It's not very often visited by tourists. And it's surprisingly suburban. Now, I'm very familiar with this part of the city because much of my mother's family was from here. My mother went to high school here, and I spent a lot of time here growing up. And so I'm aware of how suburban this part of the city feels and how it doesn't really match the stereotype of the Bronx that everyone knows, which comes from, the area around Yankee Stadium where most people live in, walk up or 6, 8, 10-story apartment buildings. This is an area where people live in most cases, single-family homes, if not 2, 3-family homes. They're either attached or not attached. They may have backyards. There's one community in this area called Country Club. It's literally what it's called, and has some $1 million homes facing the Long Island Sound. Now, this area has become a hotbed for development recently because of the fact that a lot of immigrants who have lived in the Bronx, who have become wealthier and more educated and are making more money, are moving out to this part of the Bronx and repopulating it because it really did lose population in the 90s and 2000s at the tail end of white flight. A lot of the people who lived in this part of the Bronx moved upstate to Long Island, to Florida, to Pennsylvania. And so they're moving in. And now that balance hasn't been met again, and there isn't enough housing for everybody. So what do? Well, you build up. And that has been what has become controversial in that part of the city. Like my neighborhood, the East Bronx, on this issue is still fairly conservative. And people who live there want to protect the concept of having this low-density, suburban-like community that they're used to growing up in. And so back a few years ago, there was a proposal to build a development there. It was supported by the progressives who exist in that part of the city under the umbrella of AOC, who won the congressional seat there. One of those people was Marjorie Velasquez, who was a city council member from this district. And remember, this part of the Bronx, like most of the Bronx, is super Democratic, or always was super Democratic. And no Republican had won any elected office in the Bronx since 2002. So when a proposal to rezone much of the East Bronx called the Bruckner rezoning was first proposed by the outgoing de Blasio administration a few years back, the community board opposed it. They didn't want more dense development in the community. And Marjorie Velasquez, because she was the local representative there, city council member there, she also opposed it. But she was pushed heavily by unions and other progressives, including progressives aligned with AOC, who pushed her to support it, believing, because no Republican has won there in 20 years, that there was no risk to her electorally if she was to support it. It wasn't like a Republican was going to win in the Bronx or anything, right? That was the theory. And so she was heavily influenced to turn her support around and, as some progressives at the time told me, lead a support for affordable housing developments in the community and the rezoning. And so she turned around and she supported it. Well, the end result was she actually lost re-election in 2023 to Republican Christy Memorado, who won the seat by a fairly decent margin and won it opposing the rezoning and opposing more development. This is the first time that any Republican had won any elected race in the borough of the Bronx in over 20 years. And so this was something that no one really saw coming. And even people who were the most cynical might never have believed that a Republican could win this district. Now, much of this is also aligned with a lot of the backlash to progressive politics that are hitting on crime and homelessness and other issues. This was a part of the city that progressives thought they could actually win in because it has a large Albanian population, a large minority population. AOC represents it. And so they actually ran a primary challenge. The Democratic Socialists of America group chapter ran a primary challenge against the local assemblyman last year, which failed miserably. And so no one believed that a Republican can actually win here. And one did. And it sent shockwaves through the city to many Democrats who were considering maybe using the political mandate that they have, because they would win 60, 70, 80% of the vote in the districts, to sort of run afoul of popular opinion on this and support the idea of development. Around the same time that the Bruckner rezoning was being proposed and Marjorie Velasquez was changing her opinion on it, Governor Kathy Hochul, fresh off her re-election, was supporting the idea of development and wanted to do a lot more developing of housing in New York City and the suburbs. And she was looking for allies in this cause. Long Island obviously was very much opposed to the idea of more dense development in their districts and in their counties. And she needed the support of New York City progressives and New York City politicians and some select Democrats that she can sort of win in order to get this idea passed. And Kathy Hochul's proposal, which would have done a lot of development and drastically increased the supply of housing, completely failed because both progressives opposed it and because conservatives obviously were always opposed it. There was no coalition that supported it. Now, the end result of this is that people will ask, well, what is the solution to housing if it's not built more development? Well, each side has their own solutions, right? The right has blamed immigrants and said, if we deport all the illegal immigrants, if we shut down immigration, we won't have people moving to the cities, and that will decrease the demand. So we don't have to increase the supply, we'll just decrease the demand. That might work, but also it's a very inhumane way of doing it, right? It's not a smart way of doing it. We're going to have to ruin a lot of people's lives to do it. Progressives, for their own ideas, think that the best way of doing this is to do things like a rent freeze or do things like good cause evictions that will drop the number of evictions and make it landlords unable to evict people only when they really, really, really have to. And this has become a favorite topic of progressives, and I don't really touch on this very often because my day job is a real estate agent, and so I'm in the industry, and of course that will taint my opinion on this in their eyes. But the problem what they have with that issue is that it's not going to solve the problem of housing. And the reason it's not is not because it's bad or anything. It's because the issue in housing in New York is supply and demand. And the demand is not only, and not even primarily, people who were evicted. That is a very small number of people who make up the demand. Most of the demand are people moving into the city from outside the city, which is why Republicans think if you got rid of immigrants, we wouldn't have this problem anymore. And so doing things like good cause and rent freezes, it doesn't solve that problem. It creates another problem in which it decreases supply because people aren't moving. Now, much of progressive ideas in housing are focused on the idea of people who rent their homes and their apartments and don't plan on leaving long term, which don't make up a large number of people in New York, especially their own demographic, right? If you are a young 26-year-old living in New York in a one-bedroom apartment, or you have roommates, good cause and rent freezes will help you as long as you live in that apartment. But if you plan on getting married and having a family, you're going to want to move to a bigger apartment. And in that case, these ideas don't help you. They actually hurt you because there'll be no apartments for you to rent because no one's moving. And so you're going to have the same problem that Ezra Klein talked about in his piece, which is the problem of people who move to the cities with an intention of putting down roots, and they're unable to because they can't find housing that's affordable for them to live in. I can go into this for an hour, and if you want me to, I'll definitely do a video on this. But there is problems with the way that developers do develop housing in New York, in that a lot of housing in New York is designed to look like dorm rooms because they appeal to recent college graduates who move here. Somebody who wants to put down roots and raise a family is probably not going to rent the type of 3-bedroom apartments that are common in places like Bushwick or Astoria, because there's no living space. It's just basically a dorm room style apartment. That's a whole other issue. But that also runs to the meaning of the demand, right? People who want to put down roots and live in New York, they're going to want to move to different apartments. They're going to want to buy apartments and invest in property. They're not going to want to stay in the same apartment forever. And so you need to be able to make that kind of thing work, where people can move to larger units, to move to housing that works, and be able to sort of shift to where they need to go. And to do that, you're going to have, the only thing you can do is build. There's nothing else you can do. None of the ideas that progressive supports, whether it be good cause or social housing, which has become another thing that progressives seem to like, none of that will work. Because you have to have movement in order to have this type of thing work. You have to be able to have properties for people to move to, and their ideas don't allow that. And so the question is, how do we become more like Austin or more like Florida, where the housing costs are sort of in control, or in some cases even dropping? You build. That's the only thing you could do. Now, in places like Austin, there's plenty of room to build. You could just demolish a meadow and build a housing development there. In New York, you can't really do that. And even where you can, I'll give you the example of Denver, where there was a plan to redevelop an abandoned golf course into housing, and progressives opposed it. You have to be creative as to where you build in places like New York. You have to be willing to fundamentally change neighborhoods, to make them look nothing like they did 10, 20, 30 years ago. You have to be willing to knock down housing like this and build housing like this. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not going to solve the problem. So the question I have to Ezra Klein and other people who are suggesting this is, when you have such widespread opposition to these ideas, how do you get them enacted? How do you get people elected who will do these things and make these hard decisions if they can't win votes in the first place because everyone opposes it? This is the problem that I don't think we can really solve. And I don't know how to solve that. You're going to have a situation where people like Kathy Hochul, as she was willing to do 2 years ago, are willing to take the political hit to force these types of changes in housing and development, and run afoul of her own constituents, and hope that a few years down the line, when you meet voters again, they won't punish you for it. But it's easier for people like her to do that because she has 4 years. She has 4 years to wait till she meets voters again. The legislature, which she needs to approve these ideas, meets voters every 2 years. And so that gives them a smaller window of opportunity to persuade voters they're making the right decisions. And so this is the problem. And this is what I wanted to touch on in this video. And if you have any suggestions on how to solve this problem, let me know. But it's a very hard conundrum that sort of really presents the idea that sometimes democracy doesn't deliver the results that you want it to. But I guess it's the least bad form of government, as we're finding out at the moment. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, send me a comment or an email if you're interested and have thoughts on what I'm saying today, and stay tuned for more videos and articles coming soon.